Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. I'm your host, Don Shelly, joined today by my faithful co-host, that's Alexis Shelly. How are you doing today, Lex?
I'm good. I'm virtually joining you this time.
That's right. We were just talking before we were recording here that today sort of marks a first. We always are bumping into first because the podcast is pretty early. But most of the time that Alexis and I have recorded episodes that we've joined each other on, we've actually done that in person. Today we're taking advantage of the magic of the internet and the ability to record remotely. So if we seem a little different in this particular recording today than we normally do, if you've heard us in the past, it's because we're not sitting in the same room. So the nonverbal cues going back and forth are going back and forth by video. They're not going back and forth by here in the room. Our topic today is going to be timely given the release date of this episode. And we're going to look at an event in American history that is recent, obviously a very dramatic event. We're going to look at things around 9/11, September 11th of 2001, a date that as soon as I mentioned that, I'm sure that I would assume all, but virtually all of our listeners would understand that particular event and its significance, the events of 9/11. What we're going to focus on today, though, is our historical what if. Our fork in time is actually going to focus on what may seem like a narrow part of that. We're not going to speculate on what would have happened if 9/11 had not occurred at all. What we're going to speculate on is if one of the events contained inside of the 9/11 story had been different and how that might have changed things. Obviously, if there had been no 9/11 in general, that would be a very dramatic change in history. But I think it'll be interesting to talk about what would have happened in particular if one of the events of that day had gone a little bit differently. So, Alexis, what are we going to focus on inside of the bigger 9/11 story as being the potential change in history and thus the fork in time?
Today we're going to be focusing on if one of the planes, and tend to call it the fourth plane. We'll get into that a little bit. But United 93, we're going to be focusing on if United 93 had not ultimately crashed in a field in rural Pennsylvania, but it hit its intended target.
Okay. And so to bring everybody up to speed, there were 4 flights that were hijacked that day. I think most of us know that, but just putting things in context, they were all intended to take off more or less at about the same time and were intended to be long distance flights so that they would have plenty of fuel, thus for the purposes they're going to be used to turn into flying bombs. Flights 11 and 175 are the ones that hit the World Trade Centers that we're most familiar with. Flight 77 is the hit the in the capital area, in this case hitting the Pentagon. And then Flight 93, as you mentioned, Alexis, crashes in rural Pennsylvania, just out in Somerset County, just outside of a small place called Shanksville. Certainly, when we think back to that day, the images that we have of planes crashing, the most prominent images are of the 2 that struck the World Trade Center, the populated area. Those were caught on various means of recording, either televised or happenstance for the first particular one that struck one of the towers. I've seen images that relate to what Flight 77, which struck the Pentagon, but we actually have no images of Flight 93 going down because it went down in a rural remote area. And the reason it goes down in a rural remote area, it's a hard thing for me to say rural remote. I can't roll my R's. But the reason it goes down in a rural area is believed from the things that were heard on the cockpit recorders and transcripts, and then other things that we'll talk about here briefly, that the passengers became aware of the situation generally that was going on, knew that their plane had been hijacked, and actually most likely did something to storm the cockpit or do something that actually caused the response of the hijackers to crash the plane. So, Alexis, what do we sort of know about Flight 93 in terms of what is sometimes referred to as the passenger revolt post the hijack?
We know that it basically was a concentrated effort between a lot of the passengers on the plane as they kind of figured out what was going on. There were multiple passengers on the plane that tried to call various family members. One, I think he's the one that has kind of become the most popular in terms of the. I think when I hear United 93, I automatically hear "Let's Roll" in my head. That was actually said by Todd Beamer. He was one of the passengers on the plane. He was trying to call his wife from the phone that was on the back of the seat in the plane. Ultimately, got routed to a GT phone operator by the name of Lisa Jefferson, and was kind of explaining to that operator, I think the plane has been hijacked. Here's the situation with the pilots. Here's what's kind of going on in the plane, and ultimately, with her to say, we're going to do something about this. Let's roll. And ultimately, they ended up storming that cockpit, and obviously, we don't know what exactly went down, but the ultimate result was that plane crashed and did not hit its intended target.
Right. And so let's talk briefly about the idea of intended target, because this is important. And again, our fork in time today is going to be that it did hit its intended target. So it's worthy of a conversation to talk about what that intended target might be. There are really two broad thoughts based upon the testimony that eventually was gathered by the commission and by other law enforcement sources after the fact. And it is almost universally believed that they were intended, particularly this makes sense given their flight plan when the plane actually crashed in Pennsylvania, that it was heading towards the Washington, D.C. area. And so what is believed based upon the communications that had happened with the hijackers, and again, some of the other testimony that exists, is that actually are probably two likely targets for what we will just call United 93 moving on, which is, as Alexis referred to, is sometimes referred to as the fourth plane that day. And we'll talk about why that can also be here in a minute. But what are those two potential targets, Lex?
Those two potential targets are very close to each other. DC is not very big, but the first one is the White House. The second one is the Capitol building.
Okay. And so those are the two potential targets. Now, let me say you can spend a lot of time doing this research and looking at it, which I've done and Alexis has done as well. We don't definitively know which one was the target. So we're going to talk about sort of two what-if scenarios here that I think are related but are also unrelated. Because of the discussions that took place among the hijackers, their desire for what they thought would make good targets, it's fairly clear that it was either the White House or the Capitol building. It appears that Osama bin Laden and some of those who were responsible for the planning but weren't actually engaged in the execution probably preferred the White House. Mohammed Atta, who was one of the leaders of the effort to execute that was actually inside the U.S. and was actually one of the hijackers and thus died, so not able to interview him after the fact, probably preferred the White House, but there's reason to believe that the actual hijackers that were on that plane may have preferred and thought that the Capitol building would have been an easier target. And so certainly if you're familiar with the Washington, D.C. area, if you've been there, the White House is a much smaller target physically than the Capitol building would be, and it is not in as open a space as the Capitol building would be in terms of being easy to visualize and line up on. So while it's possible that either could have been a target, and we'll talk about both, we don't know for sure which one was the target. So we'll actually speculate sort of down two lines of a potential alternate history here. We'll talk about the White House version as well as the Capitol version. Anything more you want to share on that, Alexis?
Again, kind of talking about just the geography of DC itself. If you're thinking of those two buildings, it really kind of does line itself up like a runway. So I think it's not also far off to think that maybe if the hijackers were planning to hit the White House, but for some reason maybe they overshot it, they missed it, something like that, they possibly could have said like, well, we didn't hit that one, let's go hit the other one. Because they are so close together. So I think it's valuable to talk about both as targets, because if they were planning to hit the White House but couldn't for whatever reason, they could have easily changed plans with very, very little time and decided to hit the Capitol instead.
Right. And of course, there are other targets. Those are not the only two that are there. The Washington Monument would be there. The Lincoln Memorial would be there. The other memorials, basically all of the things that are up and down the mall. So the various elements of the Smithsonian. And then, of course, if you're near the Capitol, assuming that you're not as accurate in terms of the target here. It seems very morbid to talk about it that way, but just to be sort of surgical about it, that's the Library of Congress is near there, the Supreme Court buildings. There's all of the various office buildings for the Senate and for the House of Representatives that are there. So it's not that there was a lack of targets. And of course, the Pentagon's just across the river. It's not that far away as well. So it's
Right.
not for a lack of targets. The assumption would be that they wanted to hit targets that were representative in terms of both their true value and their symbolic value. And the White House and the Capitol, based upon what is known about the communications among the hijackers and the planners before, and then there's things that make sense for their motives and their ways that they operated. Those are the two most likely candidates. So again, we're not excluding that other targets could have been hit because they might have been hit either on purpose or just by mistake in terms of not being able to accurately hit the targets, assuming they were the White House or the Capitol.
Right, right. And I think we were talking about this a little bit off air. Of course, they hit the two World Trade Center towers in New York. Those are definitely a financial symbol. Then, of course, they hit the Pentagon, which is a symbol of military strength. So it kind of fits in line perfectly with both the White House and the Capitol hitting something that represented government. So,
Right.
kind of all three of those things.
Right, and represented the essentially a political target in addition to an economic and a military target as well. So before we branch off into the what ifs, let's talk a little bit about what was unique about Flight 11 Flight 93 among the four flights that day. It actually departed from Newark, so it actually departed close to what eventually became the target for two of the planes. It actually flew from the New York area, knowing though that the nature of the hijacking required that a plane actually reach altitude where it's easier for the passengers who intended to do harm and ill will to then move about the cabin and take things over. It left Newark and it was heading towards, if I recall correctly, it was heading towards the West Coast. San Francisco, I believe, was
Yes.
its ultimate destination that day. It was a Boeing 757, so a new plane, like many of them were, and it had departed. It was intended to depart Newark International Airport at approximately 8 a.m. on the morning of September 11th, which was a Tuesday. It had 44 folks on board, 37 passengers and 7 crew. Of course, the 44 of the 44 passengers, 4 of them were the attackers, were the hijackers. It was intended to leave at 8 o'clock, but unlike the other flights that were involved that day, what's different about it, Lex?
It was delayed by a good while. It was delayed by about 42 minutes. It pulled away from the gate and essentially sat on the tarmac for quite a while, just because of airport congestion. Nothing really out of the norm. It was just a busy morning leaving Newark that morning, so it got a little behind. So it actually took off about 8:42 that morning.
Right. And the reason that's important, and that's what we're actually going to look at here as being the how the fork in time would occur, is that because it was delayed by approximately 42 minutes, and because of the events that happened with the first strikes being on the towers in New York, that's what enabled word to get out in a way to the passengers that were on Flight 93 once they realized the hijack had taken place, and once they connected to people that were off the plane telling them what had happened. That's when they became aware of the possibility that they were actually in an airplane that was now intended to be a target. So for our fork in time, where we're going to focus on here is the idea that if they had left on time or closer to being on time, the timing of the events of that morning would have meant that the passengers on Flight 93 would certainly have been aware that they were the victims of a hijacking, but would not have been aware of the nature of what that hijacking was intended to carry out, which was turning the plane into a weapon that would be used to hit a target that was on the ground. And so our fork in time will be that Flight 93 departs on time or closer to time, gets airborne, and as a result, while the passengers on Flight 93 are certainly aware that the flight has been hijacked, they don't understand the urgency of needing to take the plane down in terms of preventing it from being used essentially as a piloted missile. That makes
Correct.
sense?
Correct. I was actually just looking at the timeline, and Looks like Flight 175 was actually hijacked about the time Flight 93 was taking off.
Right.
So, again, not having the flexibility with knowing what was on knowing what was happening, um, if if that plane had taken off at its intended time of 8 a.m.
Right. And so that's going to be our fork. So just so we understand where we've split here. So now we have Flight 93 that is taken off on time, is hijacked just as it was, and the hijackers make the turn and begin to head the flight towards Washington, D.C. But again, the passengers are not aware what's happening there. So we're going to look at the first of the two possibilities, and we're going to start with the possibility of the White House. So just as a starting point, the first thing that pops into my mind is the White House is an obvious target because it is the center of the executive branch for the United States. And so, in fact, very often you will hear in describing what the United States is doing, White House officials today said, or as very often is the case for all governments across the world, where the reference is made to where the chief executive resides, as if that is the government. For example, in your case, Alexis, knowing the UK, they might say what 10 Downing Street, right? Or Downing Street says. And so
Correct.
we would say the White House did this. And when we say that, we don't mean obviously the building did that. It's representative of being the symbol of executive power. So that's what makes it an obvious target there in DC. Anything you want to say about that, Lex?
I think you're definitely right. I think the White House definitely is the symbol of the executive branch. It's definitely the symbolic gesture of government for sure.
Right. And whether the hijackers were aware or not aware of the location of the president, it might be assumed if you're planning ahead or you don't know that schedule, although it does appear that they did look to some degree at what was scheduled for elements of government. The assumption might be that if you hit the White House, you also would take out the president. That's a possibility that might be the thinking on making that the target. So it's not only hitting a building. Obviously, it's the symbolic nature of that building, but it's also the potential that what you've done essentially is assassinate a president by very non-conventional means, which is crashing an aircraft into the building where he's residing.
Right. That's not a far cry at all.
Yeah. Now, of course, as it turned out that morning, the morning of September 11th, the president was not in Washington, D.C., was actually in Florida, Sarasota, if I remember correctly. And so that was not a risk with the White House as a target that the president would be there. But who was at the White House that day?
Well, the second in command, of course, the vice president was at the White House that
That's right.
morning.
Right. Vice President Cheney was actually at the White House that morning. And so, in addition to that, there were other members of the executive branch who were there. A number of the members of cabinet and others were actually scattered around to different places. But without a doubt, Vice President Cheney was actually there in the White House that day with the president, President Bush, away in Florida. What we do know from the actual real-time line is that the expectation would have been that in the event of a potential attack and a known potential attack on the White House, the ideal thing for the Secret Service to do would have actually been to take the vice president or the president, whoever might be there that's part of the continuity of government, would have been to actually not just take them down to the bunker that exists below the White House, what's called the PEOC, the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, but actually would have been to take either the president or the vice president away from the White House to a more secure location just outside of Washington, D.C. Now, on the morning of September 11th, Alexis, what do we know about Vice President Cheney's response, even once he became aware that there was a potential for attack?
He refused to leave. He did not want to leave Washington, D.C., or the White House for that matter.
Right.
He wanted to stay put.
And so their decision was to actually take the vice president down to the bunker that exists underneath the White House, the PEOC, the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. And so that's where he went. So two things have to be assumed here again in our alternate timeline in the fork. One is that this is what happened once they were aware that there was the potential for a terrorist attack because of the events that had already taken place in New York and were going to take place there also in Washington, D.C. at the Pentagon. But it's possible to imagine, based on the timing of the flights when they departed and when they struck their targets, that United Flight 93 would have been time to be happening very close to what was happening there at there in New York. So one potential thing is we've talked about what actually happened here as a result of there being an awareness that there was a need to move the vice president to a location of safety. But one thing to keep in mind is there may not have been as much or any advance warning of a particular strike against the White House.
Correct. Yeah, I was looking again at the timeline, and something that really struck me is in the real timeline of history, they don't start evacuating the White House and the Capitol buildings until about 9:48 that morning. And that plane, the United 93, actually goes down about 10:03. So for operating on the assumption that that plane is not 42 minutes delayed, that it actually hits its target first, possibly, with no advance warning, there would not have been that mass evacuation of those buildings, and it could have been catastrophic in terms of the amount of life lost and the caliber of government official lost, just
Correct.
because lack of time and lack of warning.
Right. And again, I don't want to presume here that there would have been no warning, because certainly once the plane was hijacked and deviated off of its flight course, there would have been an awareness of that would have taken place across the entire U.S. Handling for flight. How flights are handled, air traffic control, and the other things, they would have been aware they had a hijacked situation. They would have been aware that the plane had been diverted and that the plane was moving towards Washington, D.C. So I don't want to leave the impression that it would have been an absolute no warning, no advance warning, but it certainly could have been much smaller or less in time. And as we know, fighter aircraft were in fact scrambled, potentially to down, or depending on which account you read, and it's a little confusing sometimes, even after all of these years, to know whether even those planes were even armed.
Right.
But even if they weren't armed, there was discussion about the pilots that were flying those fighter aircraft being willing to actually sacrifice themselves to, if needed, to actually collide with the planes or seek some other way to bring the planes down in a way that would have kept them from reaching their target. What we don't know is whether or not, with a shorter timeline, what would have actually happened in terms of the ability to scramble and intercept the flight. The advantage that actually existed in the real timeline for 9/11 was that there was an awareness of what was going on, again, because of what had happened in New York and the delay for Flight 93 that did enable them to scramble. Most of the accounts that you read says that NORAD, and they stated this to the 9/11 Commission, is that they would have intercepted Flight 93 if it had not crashed before it reached its target in Washington, D.C., but they weren't sure. This is actually a quote from the Commission report. NORAD did not even know the plane was hijacked until after it had crashed. So again, we're talking about a very short timeline here, and it's tough to know whether or not they would have been able to do that intercept.
Right.
Any more thoughts then on the 42-minute delay and its potential impact on, regardless of the target? Again, we're focusing here on the White House first.
Not really.
Okay, fair enough. So the White House has the vice president. So under the assumption that the White House is actually hit, there's a couple of possibilities that would exist there. I guess the first possibility, the most extreme possibility, would actually be that because of the lack of time, the vice president is not able to be evacuated even down to the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. And so one possibility would be the death or injury to, not discounting others who would have died or been injured, but to the vice president of the United States. So just thinking that through, Alexis, how would that be different if 9/11 had not just been the tragedy that it was, but actually had the second highest executive official in the United States dying as a result of the events that day?
Definitely there would have been an unease of power, of course, given the fact that the president wasn't even in Washington, D.C. at the time. So the president, of course, in that instance, is the one who has to appoint a new vice president. Of course, then we have to go through the whole thing of them being confirmed by the Senate. But there would have been this, I think, delay and apprehension of Cheney has died in the White House as a result of this attack. Bush is in Florida, as you mentioned. Bush is having to come to grips with even what's happened, before he can move forward with, okay, now I've got to appoint a new vice president. Now I've got to move forward with that. So I think there would have been this lull in politics and this lull in government as they kind of put the pieces together and tried to figure out what had just happened and how to move forward. Especially given the fact the president wasn't even in Washington D.C. at the time to really have a boots on the ground. Of course, he was getting briefed and things like that. He'd be briefed if major events weren't happening. He'd just be briefed because he was the president. But him being far removed in Florida, losing his vice president, there would have definitely been a power vacuum, for lack of a better word, in politics and government as it was worked forward to try and figure out who was going to fill that position.
Right, and even that day, there was a lot. When you go back and read the accounts and the commission reports, and there was a lot of difficulty and confusion around communications, and so even there in the Presidential Emergency Operations Center in the PIOC, where Vice President Cheney was, he had difficulty communicating there. If you don't have that as being one of the effective areas that is working, then it's even more confusing that day as they're scrambling to get the president airborne in Florida. So I was reading something again, even preparing early, just a couple of minutes before we began recording today, about the fact that there was a fuel condition on Air Force One, which is why they had to make the first stop that they made that day, in addition to getting the president in front of cameras so that the public could be reassured that he was that he was alive and well, right, and in control. But there was a lot of confusion that day that would have raised to a whole other level, obviously, if one of the centers of authority and one of the centers of communications, which the White House represented, would have been taken out. So there would have been a lot of confusion that day. And then, as you stated, the confusion that would have existed after that. Imagine the fact that there would have been a need for a state funeral,
right,
for the vice president in the coming days, while everything else, because again, in this alternate timeline, we're not talking about New York being spared. We're not talking about the events at the Pentagon not happening. We're talking about the additional strike on a target. In this case, the White House. Not that it was tragic that the flight crashes in Pennsylvania and that all of the passengers on board die as a result of that, and the crew. But it's even more noticeable because there would have definitely been casualties on the ground up to and including the vice president, and dealing with the effects of that day, but also dealing with it in the days to come while everything else was in the mode and mood that it was. I guess the other thing that jumps out at me is that, let's say that he does survive, meaning he being the vice president and others. Not everyone is down in the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. There would have been other folks at the White House who, as part of the evacuation protocol, may have been evacuated, but there could have been the loss of other officials, White House staff, and others who may not have been able to be evacuated to their places to be evacuated to, even though the vice president may have been securely evacuated to the bunker below the White House and would have been able to survive the attack on the White House. It's hard to believe that there would not have been any loss of life. If you've been to D.C., there are office buildings not that far from the White House. There are things in the area. There would have been casualties on the ground, even if they had not been the vice president, even if they had not been members of the executive branch of the United States. There would have been additional loss of life on the ground.
Right. Two things I'd like to point out on that. She's not exactly a member of the executive branch, but Laura Bush was actually scheduled to present to Senate that morning. The Senate Education Committee was scheduled to meet that morning, so she was actually in the Senate building, which, as we've mentioned, is not that far away. Washington D.C. is pretty clustered together in terms of buildings, so you might have a situation where Vice President Cheney is able to be evacuated into the bunker, but maybe not getting to First Lady Bush in time, and again, we might be dealing with a state funeral and a bereavement of the president in terms of his wife, and not being able to get her to a secure location. Also, just again talking about how densely populated DC is, how densely packed those buildings are, can't help but kind of compare a situation where the White House in this case is hit to almost the World Trade Center scenario, where just because of the impact of that hit, with that plane, it ultimately causes other buildings in the vicinity to collapse, catch fire, um, various other things. So, uh, it hitting one target does not necessarily isolate it to that one target for sure.
Right. Right. And we'll talk a little bit more about the situation with the first lady, but you make an excellent point. It's there were other things. Again, it's easy to focus on the highest ranking official that's there, which is the vice president, but that's not to say that there could not have been other impactful deaths that certainly could have as a result of that. And then, of course, the other impact is, while it's the residence of the president, it's also the office of the president, and where the executive is housed. They're in the West Wing of the White House, as well as in the executive office building that's next door to it. So if either or both of those is destroyed, damaged, rendered unusable as a result of the attacks, there's just the actual again, the disruption to where will the president, be? Where will the president be living for the next little bit of time? All the things that are small things, but are practical things in terms of what the impact would have been with the loss of the structure itself, not just what the structure represented, not just the fact that the people that were there and what they represented, but also just the loss of the structure itself in terms of just the discontinuity. I mean, imagine that the vice president is safe. The president, of course, is safe, but that evening, instead of an address from the Oval Office in the White House, the address that comes that evening from President Bush to the American people has to come from
Texas.
someplace else. Yeah, in fact, or at that point, because of the heightened security concerns, it may have also been, words that crept into our vocabulary a great deal in those days were undisclosed location. And so
Right.
it would have been the president that night addressing the nation from an undisclosed location or from a military base somewhere because the White House has been lost. In fact, one of the things I know when you go back and read and watch documentaries and the other things that are that day, it was incredibly important in President Bush's mind that he get back to Washington and that address be made from the Oval Office to provide a sense of continuity for the American people and a sense of, yes, things have happened, but I'm speaking to you from the Oval Office. That was a very important thing that he wanted to make sure happened for the speech that was delivered by TV that night.
Right. He definitely knew the benefit of that symbolism for sure. Another thing I kind of wanted to point out, going back a little bit to, we were talking about lack of communication that day. I think I heard something from a former maybe Secret Service or somebody like that when the president was leaving Florida and getting on Air Force One, and it was like, where are we going? And it was like, we'll decide that later. Just get in the air.
Right.
So when Air Force One takes off from Florida, they don't even really know where they're going. They know they have to make a fuel stop, but they don't know what their ultimate destination is. Of course, we have Bush wanting to go back to Washington, wanting to go back to the Oval Office, but he ultimately made that decision, but he was not the only one involved in making that decision, and there were other people definitely pushing for other locations.
Right, right. And of course, the first landing is at Barksdale Air Force Base, which is in Louisiana, and then ultimately he finds himself in, I forget the name of the base now, but the base that's in a SAC base that's in the middle of the United States, somewhere up in Nebraska, if I remember correctly, before making the flight back, and of course is on Air Force One. So that's talking about the scenario with the White House. Now let's talk briefly about the scenario with the Capitol. We've already hit upon this. You mentioned it already. The Capitol building was in use that day. The Congress was back in session. In fact, they had just recently come back from their summer recess and from time off. And so one of the things that you actually see in the attackers' planning discussions is making sure that Congress would be back in session by the time they executed the attack. That's part of the reason for waiting until September to make sure that that it would be a viable target because Congress would be there. And in fact, we do know that it was right before the Senate was set to convene that day that the news became apparent that there had been the hijacking and then the striking of the targets in New York, and then ultimately also there in Washington, D.C., and then all of the things that began with the evacuation of the Capitol. Speaker of the House, Hastert, who would have been third in line of the presidency as part of the continuity of government, he was actually taken away to the location that exists. I'm trying to remember. I believe that's also in Pennsylvania, where they have the where they have the one of the locations that they would take members of Congress to. And so we have the Capitol evacuating, and we do have the potential for members of Congress, certainly their staffs, other employees at the Capitol, again, under this element of not having as much time, that it's more of a surprise hit to the Capitol, that we would have a loss of life there in addition to the symbol being struck.
Definitely.
And so, again, one possibility would be is that the First Lady was scheduled to speak that morning. She was scheduled to speak at the Russell Office Building, which is one of the buildings there near the Capitol. And so one of the possibilities would have been not just the loss of life in general at the Capitol, not just the loss of elected leaders and members of Congress, but the possibility that a potential person who could have been killed or injured, or would have been very close to the possibility of being killed or injured, would have been the First Lady of the United States.
Correct. And again, we've touched on this before. Her husband's not even in the city. He's in a completely different state. So he was already desperate to get back to Washington D.C. I can only imagine if suddenly we're dealing with a widower of a president trying to get back to Washington D.C.
Yeah, and I'm not going to head down the path of speculation about, would there have been some type of emotional response that day with President Bush as the commander in chief? I think that's speculative. We would never know, but there is no doubt that it would have been a very different set of circumstances for him that day to perhaps be very quickly informed that the First Lady had been killed or had been injured, or just to be in the scenario of not knowing her status while
Right.
that's going on. It's very easy to realize that would have had an impact on what was there. I tend to want to think his first thought would have been as president, but he's also a husband, and he's a man, and so there would have been that going on at the same time, and all of that would have again added to the confusion and the chaos, which was already chaotic enough that day. If the Capitol had been hit, not knowing where other members of Congress were, not knowing if you're the Secret Service and others who are responsible for maintaining the continuity of government, where, for example, where is the Speaker of the House? Where is the President Pro Tem of the Senate, which was Robert Byrd, who's fourth in line? Just all of the things that would have been happening just in the regular way that continuity of government works, that would have been in more disarray. We already talked about this with the White House, would have been in equal disarray or maybe even more disarray with what's going on with the Capitol being hit as a symbol.
Right. I mean, if you think about the Capitol building, it's basically an anthill. There are so many people milling around. There's so many people, so many things that are happening in that one building. So if you go and you squash it, for lack of a better word, with an attack, how do you kind of form order out of that chaos?
Right, and while it's true that there are visitors and guests that and tourists that tour the White House, the Capitol is much more of the type of thing that someone can visit as a tourist, just to be there to visit and to see it. So you definitely would have had civilians that were in the Capitol or around the Capitol grounds that definitely would have been impacted by a potential strike there. So again, all loss of life equally being considered disastrous here. So it's not just, the fact that members of Congress potentially would have died or their staffs, but you also have other innocent civilians who could have potentially been on the Capitol grounds that would have been injured or killed or affected by what was there. And again, if you've been there and you know this, directly across the street, across the grounds, but across the street is the Library of Congress, the Supreme Court building, the various office buildings. So the possibility exists that the damage would not have been contained just to the Capitol proper, but actually would have also potentially been the buildings that were around there. And so under that scenario, again, you have all of the confusion on the day of the event of an additional high-profile target being hit. But then you also have the psychological impact with either the White House, but also with the Capitol, of imagining the sun rising on September 12th, and what's the state of the Capitol?
Right.
Maybe the dome has been destroyed. Maybe it's collapsed. Maybe one end is still burning. That's a very, just in many of, one of the interesting things that happens for me, as I think through this, as a result of the actual collapse of the World Trade Center towers in New York, is that there's all the devastation in the aftermath, the cleanup at what we refer to as ground zero, but it wasn't an ongoing. In fact, in many ways, it wasn't an easily visible thing once the towers had collapsed because it's surrounded by other structures, and being able to see what's going on there, except for the cameras that were there. But imagine a scenario where the Capitol is burning for the better part of a day, or maybe still smoldering into the next day, and that's a much more open symbol. If you've been to Washington D.C., it resides on one end of the National Mall, and it's visible all the way from the Lincoln Memorial, as well as other sight lines. And so to see a destroyed Capitol psychologically, like I say, as the sun rises on September 12th, would have had I think, a profound effect. Not to minimize the effect of the Twin Towers going down in New York, but I think it would have been a slightly different visual that we would have in our heads if the Capitol had been struck, or the White House had been struck as a target.
I think that's an interesting concept. I think when we think of the Twin Towers, they've become iconic. Not to sound too jaded or too flippant about it, but they became iconic because they fell. I'm thinking specifically of the image of the two beams of light that kind of shoot up into the night sky, replacing the towers. If you have a scenario where you have the Capitol building in this instance being hit, that is a very iconic structure that, again, if it's burning for multiple days or smoldering for multiple days, or you just have a half collapsed dome on top, that's a very powerful symbol and a very powerful picture to be looking at.
Right. If you think about parts of U.S. currency, for example, what do they show? They show the outline, or the image of the Capitol building as a symbol that's there. In fact, I can't help but think, related to that, of one of the things that those who really know history well, particularly American history well, will know that the dome of the Capitol, as we think of it now, was being built during the American Civil War.
Right.
And so, in the time shortly thereafter, and so it's thought of as being, that sort of a symbolic. That becomes a very symbolic thing for some historians when they write about the Civil War, of the image of the nation is divided, but the Capitol is being, the dome is being built on the Capitol. So now imagine again the symbolic nature of the thing that probably is most dramatic in my mind is, imagine that the Capitol dome is not completely destroyed, but it's partially destroyed. I also can't help but think of a recent event here that may be along the same lines. And Alexis, this is more near and dear to you because you've actually visited the location. But when the fire happened in France at Notre Dame,
Right.
The image of Notre Dame is a symbol.
It is iconic, yes.
It's very much an iconic symbol for the French people, obviously for the church there as well, but it's also a French national symbol. And so imagine the U.S. secular government equivalent of that, which would be the thing that I think of. If you think about, we talked about the executive being referred to as the White House. If newspaper writers or other journalists are reporting, when they talk about something that Congress is doing, they'll say, and meanwhile at the Capitol, using that as the symbol for it.
Right.
So now again, so that's an exploration of the two possible targets, probably longer than we spent doing that, but we began to get into what would have been different. Mainly there, we talked about the near-term differences, that day for either the White House or for the Capitol, or the coming days thereafter because of that disruption. Anything more you can think about that you want to share or want to relate when it comes to the near-term impact of going down the different timeline?
I think we've pretty much covered the near term. It definitely would have shaken things up, definitely, for sure.
No doubt about that. Now, the other impact, though, is not the near-term impact in my mind. It's actually the longer-term impact. And so I guess one of the questions to ask or to think about in an alternate timeline is, there's no doubt that the United States government, the United States as a people, had a response to the events of 9/11. Eventually, there is the effort to go into Afghanistan, to get to those who are responsible. There's the second war in Iraq, all the things that flow from that, where the United States goes on a more of a war footing, a proactive offensive military footing in response to the events of 9/11. So I guess the question that I want to throw out there, interested in your thoughts, Alexis, and then I'll share mine, is it possible, that was pretty ratcheted up, to say the least, but is it possible that things would have ratcheted up even more as a result of losing the White House or the Capitol?
I think definitely. I think we talk about, bringing things up to 11 or bringing things up. It definitely was ration it up. Let's bring it up to a 50. Let's let's bring it way up. I think if you have a scenario where the Capitol building or the White House is hit, I think there'd be more of a, not that there wasn't this sense already, but more of a, they hit us at home. They hit us where it hurt. I mean, we talk about the White House. Yes, we talk about it as the seat of the executive branch. We talk about it as this form of government. We call it the White House because it was a house. It was a place of residence. And so I think if you have that scenario of hitting one of those two targets, I think there would have been more of a response, not to say there wasn't already, but I think more of a response of, they really hit us personally. They hit us in our home,
Right.
where we're supposed to feel safe.
Right. And I do think, it's hard to imagine the psychology being ratcheted up even more. I mean, it's when I think through that, I'm like, I remember those events.
I was
You
in fifth
were
grade.
you were in fifth grade, so you were old enough to understand that things were happening and intelligent enough, obviously, to process those things, but processing them not as an adult. You were processing them as, in your case, you were processing them as a 10-year-old. But
Right.
but I do think that for many of us who were adults at the time and remember those those events very well, it's hard to imagine that things would have been even more emotional. But when I think about it, I really do believe the possibility exists that it would have been more emotional, and I think there would have been more likelihood of a desire by the American people, certainly by the political, executive, maybe even the military apparatus of the United States. Uh, I don't want to say to get revenge, but to get to those who caused this to happen. And I think you point out well when you talk about the White House, we lose a little bit of that house thing there. It's the residence of the president. So if it's the White House that's hit, you know, how are we going to protect the president of the United States? How are we going to protect our government in the case of the Capitol? So we certainly have had enhanced security by an order of magnitude post 9/11, but I think you would have seen even more push for security related things and concerns about security around government as well.
Right. Quick thing talking about being safe, just kind of going back to what I remember about that day. Of course, you mentioned I was in fifth grade. I was 10, and I remember just being mad that I was left at school all day. By the end of the day, there was myself and one other person in my class. And I remember coming home that night and kind of getting in yours and mom's face, to be honest. Like, hey, why didn't you come get me? And I remember mom saying, you were safer at school. You were safer where you were. We left you where you were because that's where you were safe. So I think it goes back to, if you've had that scenario of hitting the White House or the Capitol, you've made us feel unsafe.
Right.
That's the ultimate problem that we have here, and that's what we need to address.
I think that's a good point. Again, it's hard not to think through the emotions of everything we're talking about here, in addition to the practical thoughts. In fact, the practicalities, as we've been going through this and as we were thinking about doing this episode, it's hard to focus on the practicalities because there is an emotional element to it. And so, uh, you know, I think it would have. I remember, one of the things that we certainly all remember, seeing the images of the flags that were raised there near the 9/11, near the Ground Zero site. The return of for me, I'm a baseball fan. The return of baseball, the first games that were there in New York, following the events and the symbols that the flags represented, for example. Those are all the types of things that we think through as being, what happened on 9/11. Again, now add an element to that of the reconstruction of the Capitol, the reconstruction of the White House, and just this ongoing emotion of, why is why is Congress meeting in a bunker somewhere in Pennsylvania? Well, it's out of concerns for security.
Right.
Uh, you know, we are not able to, as you I think well pointed out, it hit us at home. We're not able to function the way we normally want to function. And so you would have had more of this disruption that would have existed. And it's easy for me to imagine how that would have played over potentially into the decisions that are being made, because while decisions are normally made rationally and with a lot of thought, there was an emotional element that was going on to the decision making around that particular time, and the impact of what was there that I think would have been changed at least somewhat by those that were making the decisions, because it would have been closer to home, the White House or the Capitol. Even if the White House is not the target, from the White House you can see the Capitol, or the other
Right.
way around. And so those are not isolated scenarios that are happening there. It's part of the bigger whole of what's taking place in DC and during the period of time after the event.
Absolutely.
And then I guess the final thing that I just want to hit upon in terms of that longer term outlook on how this might have changed is the fact that it may have been more of an emboldened encouragement for subsequent attacks. We don't know. There was the instance there of Flight 93 overcoming the situation. Um, you know, does that mean that others, would have been less likely to try things if? Would others have been more likely to try things? Would there have been potential subsequent attacks if all of the particular attacks have been viewed as being successful?
I think that's not a far cry or unrealistic assumption. It kind of would have been a situation of, hey, all four of our planes hit their targets. We're gonna hit them again when they're down. Especially if you're dealing with the scenario of the fourth plane hitting its target, either the White House or the Capitol building. Again, we've hit on it multiple times. That is the center of government. So we have this kind of scrambling, and we have this period of uncertainty with what's going on in the executive branch and in the government. So that would have been a almost perfect opportunity for another attack, or for at least another attempt on an attack, because you didn't have a centralized government, a centralized plan of attack, for lack of a better term, going forward. So I think that's not a far cry at all.
Right. And I think the other thing that goes with that is obviously the logical extension of that being in either scenario, there would have been a lasting effect, again, on the psyche of those that were in power and those that were in politics. Again, thinking about this as being an ongoing war footing. The term that I keep coming back to in my mind, I keep trying to find a better way to say it, is that the United States goes on to a war footing as a result of the attacks of 9/11. And I think that gets ratcheted up, even if it's only a small amount. You mentioned going, the old adage about turning it up to 11. Even if it's only going from 10 to 11, it was already at a 10. If you
Right.
take it from a 10 to a 30 or a 50, whatever multiplier you want to use to describe that, again, not being morbid, attaching, numeric values to human life, but there would have been this higher sense of something needs to be done. We need to strike back. Those who have done this need to pay. We need not so much retaliate, but we need to make it clear that you can't do this and not have repercussions with respect to making an attack on the United States. And again, I think there's no doubt that attacking the two World Trade Center towers and attacking the Pentagon was an attack on the United States. An attack that would have hit the White House and the Capitol, in addition to that, would have made it even more so that it was an attack on the United States government and on our democracy. I mean, the thing that particularly the Capitol represents is the idea of democracy.
Right.
And so you not only attacked the United States, you not only have cost American and other lives, but you've attacked our institutions, you've attacked our way of life, you've attacked our government. Again, I very much appreciate what you said there about the idea of you've attacked somebody's house.
Right.
And
You've made
so
this personal. Yes,
exactly.
yes, they're symbols, but you've made it personal.
Yeah, and then again, under some of the scenarios that we looked at there, where it could have been even more personal, is the loss of uh,
First
recognized
lady.
leaders, elected leaders, the first lady, the types of things that would make it even more personal in terms of the loss. Not to say that the loss of life that day wasn't tremendous, but there are certain folks who lost their life that day that are in some ways more well known because they're representative of something. And so obviously the first lady, the vice president, all of these are potential representatives of things that make their death not just the loss of an individual life, but make their death something that is even more dramatic and even more profound.
Right.
The other little interesting, it's related and not related to this, but it's something that we were talking about just the other day. Alexis, you were talking about something that you had read regarding the deaths that are associated with 9/11. You want to share that?
Yeah, this is a sobering fact. It kind of hit me when I read it, but actually, of course, we have those undying images of, the cleanup of 9/11 and the multi-week process that was. And actually, it has been determined that the deaths related to cancers and illnesses and diseases like that from the dust and the particles that were in the air at those cleanup sites, the deaths have actually superseded and exceeded the deaths that actually occurred on the day itself, on 9/11 itself, which is a very sobering statistic to read, that we're now this will be 18 years out, and more people have died in those subsequent 18 years from related diseases to 9/11 than actually passed away on the day itself.
Right. So, we talk so many times about the loss of life that day in the thousands, but really when we look now at the total loss of lives that were impacted, that number has grown dramatically, and it's tough to know. But I think it's not an unreasonable thing at all to imagine that a strike on the White House or on the Capitol would have been far more than the 44 the 44, and I'm including the hijackers there, so the 40, if you will, innocent lives that were lost in United 93. I think that number would have been those 40 plus maybe 100, maybe another 1,000. It's hard to know exactly what the case would have been. But it's certainly the death toll continues to climb, and the impact, even as we move further and further away in time from the event, the impact continues to be felt in a real way, an enduring way, by some of the families.
Yeah, it's also sobering to, I interact with in previous life I worked with kids, actually fifth graders, ironically, considering that's what I was on the day of at 9/11 itself. And I think the first time it hit me that I was talking to kids who actually weren't even alive when this event happened. It's an interesting perspective to have, that we have a whole new generation who don't remember this day, because I can remember it like it was yesterday. So it's an interesting thing to think about for sure.
Yeah, no doubt about that. Well, if we don't have anything else particular to say, then I think we've done a pretty good job of at least exploring some of the what ifs of a different scenario on September 11th for United Flight 93. And while it's certainly true that it's a shame that anyone lost their life that day, and those that were on Flight 93, which are many of them are thought to be heroes now because of what they did in response to that, it's important to remember that it could have been worse. Even though it was bad, it could have been worse, and we should be, I guess, in some ways, ironically thankful for parts of the way that the real timeline unfolded versus either of these two what ifs, because they would have been much more impactful that day. They also would have been much more impactful in the coming days, and potentially the things that would have happened as a result since then. Perhaps what the United States may have done in terms of where it went militarily might have been different, based upon a different sentiment about the attackers and what they had attacked. Any closing thoughts before we bring it to a close, Alexis?
Just since we are releasing on actually September 12th, so just to never forget 9/11, and to just constantly remind yourself of where you were that day and what that day really means, and maybe take a little extra minute to think about the 40 innocent that were on United 93 and the things they did to ultimately bring that plane down.
Yeah, I think there are, you mentioned earlier, and I think that's a good sort of close out with this. We sometimes think of them as the fourth plane because it was not that it was invisible. There's a site there that is a monument, a memorial, that's actually there where the flight crashed in the in the Pennsylvania, um, in rural Pennsylvania. But it doesn't probably come to mind as much when people think about 9/11. They definitely think about the Twin Towers. They definitely think about the Pentagon. It's almost like I hate to say this, but it's almost like it's an afterthought to think about Flight 93 in terms of the impact of that day. But it was impactful on those families. It was impactful for a lot of other ways. So we certainly, I think you make a good point there, Alexis, which is we all need to be more careful about how we remember and why we remember as well. So as we close out here for this episode of A Fork in Time, we thank you for joining us. We thank you for letting us explore this particular what if related to a very dramatic day that most of us probably do remember. It's close enough in history, which is not always the case in what we cover here, that it's something that's fresh on our minds and something we can think through perhaps in terms of a what if a little bit more, not easily, but it's a little bit more accessible to us because it's a what if that happened in our lifetime. Again, we appreciate you as listeners. Just as we close out here, a reminder, there's a lot of ways that you can connect to us. Almost all of those can be found at our website, which is www.aforkintimepodcast.com. There you can find how to access episodes, including past episodes, connect to the podcatchers of your choice to be able to subscribe. Also, ways to provide comments back to us in the where the notes from the podcast are sort of released. There's a place to do comments there. Each episode normally gets a notes posting or news posting there on the website. So certainly we welcome your comments for particular episodes back on those particular postings that are there. You can find a number of different ways to support us that are there on the page. One of the best ways that you can support us is just let people know we exist. That can be by word of mouth, sharing us on social media. That can be things like Facebook and Twitter and the other places where we have a social media presence. It can also be going to your podcatcher of choice, and if they offer the opportunity to do ratings or reviews, to be able to give us feedback there and give us ratings, that helps us to be found in the search engines. For those of you that have been following the posts on the website, we've been growing pretty dramatically here in the third month of the podcast, and they were up probably about 60% in terms of the number of listeners just in the 4-week period of time here. And we know that's a result of folks getting the word out and finding us through various means, so you can help us that way. If you are able and feel compelled to, you can also find there via the links that are on the website connections to our Patreon page, where you can go and actually become either a supporter or a patron of the podcast. There's some extra perks for doing that, some additional episodes, the ability to have preferential treatment when it comes to episode topic suggestions, even the opportunity to potentially be a guest host on the podcast. We'd certainly welcome having some of our listeners become participants that way and giving back to the listening community. But in all those various ways that you support us, we thank you most for giving us some of your time and some of your attention. That's one of the most generous things that you can do for us, and we are very aware that that's something that we should treasure, and we do here at A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Any closing thoughts, Alexis, before we finally close it out?
Just say thanks for joining us, and you mentioned social media, so good job, Dad.
I have to do that. I'm required by law because it's part of what you do in your everyday world, and it's a great way to get the word out. Just sharing us on Facebook, sending a note to your friends, those types of things, or other forms of social media, Twitter, can help your friends find us. If you're interested in this, you may know somebody who would be interested in what we do here at A Fork in Time. So again, closing out this episode, I'm Don. I'm your host. The co-host today is Alexis, and we just want to remind you, as we always do, if you happen upon A Fork in Time, what should be done, Alex?
Take it.
Take it. Have a great day, guys.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Join us next time.